Shalom everyone, my name is Jacqueline Luz and I'd like to welcome you all to a new video on our channel. And today's video is called Yosef and his brothers testing fidelity to receive the blessing part 1. And we will analyze the first part of this topic in chapters 42 to 43. In the previous chapter, we saw how Yosef was assigned as governor over Egypt after having explained to Pharaoh the meaning of his dreams. He put him as a ruler over Egypt, and he was in charge of storing and feeding the Egyptians during the 7 years of abundance and the 7 years of famine. In today's chapters, we will see how Yosef tests his brothers to see if they have changed since the day they sold him. They finally are able to see each other again, and we will see how all of this evolves, or how all of this just demonstrates itself throughout the 2 chapters that we're going to analyze today. And these tests that Yosef puts towards his brothers have the purpose to see if they had stopped being those young people that were immature that he had last seen, and if they had since then changed and have become worthy of receiving the food. So to begin analyzing, we will first remember how Yosef's brothers were. And if we remember, in chapter 37, we analyzed the characteristics that can be found within the brothers of Yosef. In chapter 37, verses 2 and 4, it says, "These are the genealogies of Jacob. When Yosef was 17 years old, he was a youth. He was shepherding the flocks with his brothers, with the sons of his father's wives Bilhah and Zilpah. Yosef brought back a bad report about them to their father." And in verse 4 it says, "When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak to him in shalom." They could not speak to him in peace because of that hatred that they had against him. And so Joseph's brothers had a bad reputation due to the incorrect behavior that they would show. And in addition to that bad reputation, they showed emotions such as hatred or resentment against their brother Yosef, as we can see in these 2 verses. And this came because Yosef would go and tell his father Yaakov everything that his brothers would do, telling him about the misbehaviors, of the bad deeds that they would do whenever he wasn't around. So in other verses later on in this chapter, we also see that his brothers were leaving the place where they were supposed to be grazing the sheep. In verses 13 and 17, it says, "Israel," or Yaakov, said to Yosef, "Aren't your brothers grazing the flocks in Shechem? Come, let me send you to them." "Here I am," he said to him. So here we see that Yosef, or that Israel, is starting to have this understanding that maybe they're not there where they were supposed to be, and he just wants to verify with Yosef that they actually are, or at least see where they were really going to, or where were they actually at. And so we see here that Yosef demonstrates obedience as he says, "Here I am." And then verse 17 it says, "The man said, 'They moved on from here, for I heard them saying, let's go to Dothan.' So Yosef went after his brothers and found them in Dothan." So here we see that Yosef went towards Shechem. He saw that his brothers weren't there, but he encountered a man who told him where his brothers had headed off to. And that is exactly where he found them. So this obviously annoyed his brothers to see that Yosef was going after them, and that eventually he was going to tell his father about everything that they were doing. And so we see in this chapter that they decided to get rid of their brother Yosef. At first they wanted to kill him, but then Reuben, being the older one, he stops them and he gives them another idea. And so then Yosef is thrown into a cistern so that the beasts could devour him, or the wild beasts. But later on, we see that when Reuben leaves Yosef and his brothers, we see that Judah comes up with this idea to sell Yosef, to get rid of him to the merchants that were passing through there. And so we see that those merchants had taken him to Egypt. And we can see this in verses 23 to 28 of chapter 37. Now, this is the last time in which Yosef has an encounter with his brothers. We see that this encounter isn't really that nice or that memorable, It's something that maybe would have potentially left something like hatred within Yosef, maybe a bit of how would I say it? A bit of indignation against his brothers for the actions that they had done and for what they had done towards him to get rid of him and not allowing him to go back with his father and in the family where he was safe at. So this could have potentially left something within Yosef to be upset and to hold this grudge against his siblings. But we're going to see in these chapters that wasn't necessarily the attitude that Yosef had shown. And from that point that he had last seen his brothers when they sold him, there was approximately a gap of about 22 years before Yosef was able to finally see his father and his family again. So now that we kind of recall already this background story between Yosef and his brothers, and most importantly, the attitude, the actions, and the mindset that his brothers used to have, we're going to begin analyzing chapter 42 from verses 1 to 7, where we begin to see the encounter that Yosef had with his brothers. It says, "Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, because, as we read also in the previous chapter, the famine had reached Canaan too. And it says, so Jacob said to his sons, 'Why are you looking at each other?' Then he said, 'Look, I've heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some grain for us so that we'll live and not die.' So Joseph's brothers went down, 10 of them, to buy grain from Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob did not send, for he said an accident might happen to him." So knowing or seeing what had happened with Yosef after he sent him after his brothers, we see that Jacob now has this mindset where he can't send Benjamin away. Otherwise, something could happen to him as well. Maybe he could lose his son as well. It continues saying, "The sons of Israel went to buy grain among the others who were coming, because the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Yosef was the ruler over the land. He was the provider of grain for all the people of the earth. Then Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. When Yosef saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he made himself unrecognizable to them. Then he spoke harshly and said to them, 'Where have you come from?' 'From the land of Canaan,' they said, 'to buy grain as food.'" So we see that Yaakov tells his sons to go buy grains of food because of the famine that had reached Canaan, and they needed to survive. They needed food to live. And so these brothers, 10 of them, they go towards the land of Egypt and bow down before Yosef, asking for food. So as I mentioned, Yaakov did not send his son Benjamin because he was his last and only son left from his wife Rebecca. And we could also see this as Benjamin being his last hope. If we remember, we can remember analyzing that Yaakov had this hope that Yosef would be the one who would continue on with that promise or that heritage that the father had given them through Abraham. And we can understand this mindset because really when we analyze or when we see all of the brothers or all of Yaakov's sons, we can see that the one that stands out the most is Yosef because of his obedience not only towards his own father, but towards the eternal Father. His obedience towards the eternal Father, that perseverance, that understanding, and always that willing to listen to the Elohim. So we can see why Yaakov would think that it would be through Yosef that promise would be carried on. But then him thinking or having that understanding that Yosef had disappeared, that he wasn't there anymore, he wasn't alive potentially, he thinks now that the only hope he has is Benjamin, and that it is only through him that he could inherit the promise of the eternal Father that he had made through the patriarchs. In verse 7, it also says that Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with faces to the ground. Now, this is a very important verse because here we can see the fulfillment of the dream that Yosef had in chapter 37, verse 7, where it says, "They were binding sheaves in the middle of the field. All of a sudden, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." This is a dream that Yosef had, and he was sharing it towards his brothers. Now, Joseph's brothers did not know that the person before them was actually their brother, Yosef, whom they had sold to the merchants, because he stood before them, and the text says that he was unrecognizable. And we understand that he was unrecognizable because he was before them with authority and power as governor over Egypt. So obviously they didn't expect to go to Egypt and find their brother as a governor. They maybe had thought that he had already died or that he was sold off as a slave somewhere, but they wouldn't expect him to be governor over Egypt. So when we remember that this is a fulfillment of Yosef's dream, this moment or the scene that we see in this chapter, we remember that his brothers did not believe him. And actually, they were upset and they had become angered against him for what he was saying. They were pretty incredulous as to what his dreams really were. And they didn't want to understand that there was actually a meaning behind it, which was that Elohim would make Yosef stand at a higher authority than all of them, and that eventually they would have to bow down before him. And it had to do with this that we see right here, and that we're going to continue understanding in later chapters. Understanding that the Eternal had plans with Yosef, and he had very important plans that he was going to unfold with Yosef and through Yosef for the people of Israel. In verse 7, we see that Yosef had become unrecognizable to them, and that he also spoke harshly, and that he said to them. And this is where we see Yosef, instead of letting his emotions or letting himself be moved by emotions, he remains as a firm man before his brothers so that they would not recognize him. And we could probably ask ourselves, wouldn't it be more, or we could probably expect more for Yosef to have gone up to his brothers and maybe cried before his brothers, revealing that he was actually Yosef, that he was actually the lost brother that they had. Or he could have also gone before them and made them remember everything that they had done to him, made them remember that they had sold him, and that is why he was at the position that he was then. But we don't see that type of attitude with Yosef. Instead, he remains firm, and he doesn't show himself or who he truly was before them. And a question we could ask ourselves from this is, why would Yosef have done this? And the answer is that he wanted to see what was within the hearts of his brothers. He was scrutinizing them, testing them, trying to see where the integrity of those brothers who years ago had sold him out of the envy and hatred they had against him. Where was that integrity now? And to test them, Yosef puts them in a situation where they had to prove their identity. In verses 9 to 20, it says, "Though Yosef recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then Yosef remembered the dreams he had dreamt about them. He said to them, 'You're spies. You've come to see the undefended places in the land.' 'No, my lord,' they said to him. 'Your servants came to buy grain as food. All of us, we are sons of one man. We're honest. Your servants have never been spies.' 'Not so,' he said to them. 'Rather, you've come to see the undefended places in the land.' But they said, 'We, your servants, are 12 brothers, sons of one man in the land of Canaan. Look, the youngest is with our father today, and the other one is no more.' Yosef said to them, 'It's just like I told you when I said you're spies. By this you'll be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you'll not leave from here until your youngest brother comes here. Send one from among yourselves to get your brother, while you remain confined, in order to test your words, to see whether the truth is with you. If not, by the life of Pharaoh, you're definitely spies.' So he put them together in custody for 3 days. Then Yosef said to them on the 3rd day, 'Do this and you will live. I fear Elohim. If you're honest, let one of your brothers remain as a prisoner in the guardhouse where you've been, while you go and bring grain for the hunger in your homes, and your youngest brother bring to me so that your words can be verified, and you won't die.' So they did." From verses 9 to 20, we see how Yosef accuses his brothers, saying that they were spies, that they had gone to the land of Egypt to spy. And he does this to inspect the hearts of his brothers to test and see if they had changed. So this attitude that we see from Yosef was actually because he was inspired and he was moved by the Eternal's Ruach. It wasn't just Yosef acting in that way for no specific reason, but the reason was with the Father. And that is why he was making these accusations against them, potentially knowing himself as well that they weren't actually going there to spy. But through all of this, he was testing them to see if they were going to be able to receive that food. And we also see in these verses that to justify themselves, his brothers respond by saying, "No, my Lord." In verse 10, they said to him, "Your servants came to buy grain as food." Here we can quickly see that his brothers are not proud, nor do they get carried away by their emotions. An attitude they could have probably demonstrated, taking into consideration or remembering the attitude that they used to have back then when they were younger, is maybe this attitude of self-defense, saying, "Why are you calling us spies if we're just coming before you for food?" And maybe they could have even returned back home without any food, feeling offended for the accusations that were being made against them. But we don't see that. Instead, we see them humble themselves before the authority that is before them, whom they have as Lord of Egypt. And they also call themselves as his servants. Something that, if we remember, something that they probably would have never called themselves in front of Yosef. With Yosef's dream, when he told them that they were going to bow down before him, we see that act of defensiveness, how they were offended by the fact that Yosef, one of the younger brothers, was saying that everybody else that was older than them or older than him were going to bow down before him. So in this case, we see that they have this authority and they're respecting that authority. They become humble and they don't question that authority either. Instead, they begin to defend themselves, but in a very passive manner. They defend themselves by speaking the truth as to who they really are. And Yosef, on the other hand, we see that he continues to pressure them, saying that they were spies. And they respond by saying that they were the sons of the same man, talking about Abraham in verse 11. And they say, "We are honest. Your servants are not spies." Now here his brothers are describing themselves as honest men. And we see part of that honesty as they tell Yosef that they were all children of the same man. And also in verse 13, when they tell Yosef that they were 12 brothers, sons of a man from the land of Canaan, and that the youngest, Benjamin, was with his father, while the other, talking about Yosef, had disappeared. So we also see the honesty as they begin to explain all of these details to the governor of Egypt, to Yosef. We see that honesty that just naturally almost comes out of them. They could have lied, they could have probably held back, but instead we see that they continue to speak in honesty. And they continue to describe themselves even more so that Yosef could trust them. And they do this to verify themselves, to verify that really they are there, but they're not actually spies. They're there because they are honest, and they're only there for the grain of food, or for that food that they need to get for the land of Canaan. And we continue seeing that the brothers continue to describe themselves in more details, their identity, who they were, and that they mentioned that they were 12 brothers in total, even though there were only 10 before Yosef. And they also talk about the younger brother, and they talk about the brother that they say is missing. So we understand that this is the first change in attitude that we begin to see in Yosef's brothers. Now from verses 21 to 24, we're going to continue reading, and it says, "Then each man said to his brother, 'We're truly guilty for our brother. We saw the distress of his soul when he begged us for mercy or for favor, but we didn't listen. That's why this distress has come to us.' Reuben answered them and said, 'Didn't I tell you, don't sin against the boy? But you didn't listen. Now, see how his blood is now being accounted for.' They did not know that Yosef was listening, since there was an interpreter between them. He turned away from them and wept. When he turned back to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and tied him up before their eyes." In these verses that we just read, we see how the test that Yosef was giving his brothers was making them remember and reflect on the act that they had committed by selling their brother Yosef. And it was making them reflect so that they would, inside their hearts, recognize, in a sense, the fault they had committed. And this test that Yosef was putting on his brothers was making them reconsider their actions and actually have fear for what they had done and understand that their actions also had consequences. And those consequences, as they had interpreted it, were beginning to demonstrate themselves now at that moment when they were in Egypt. So we see that there's an interpreter between him and his brothers, so that they don't know that he can actually speak in the same language as they are speaking. And he is getting everything translated, and he continues on with this act. So he doesn't know who he really is. My apologies. And we could think that maybe by him hiding his true identity, it's also helping for them to reflect and really analyze the type of situation that they were in, and remember everything that they had done to Yosef. Maybe if Yosef had revealed who he really was, they could have probably run away. They could have probably become overwhelmed by their emotions, and maybe they could have started to apologize to him without Yosef truly understanding or knowing if those apologies were actually true and they were actually coming from them because they naturally had already changed, or if it was because they had that weight in their lives and because they had that guilt. And it was just the guilt that was moving them to ask for forgiveness. So here we begin to see how this test that Yosef is putting on his brothers is actually really helping them in many aspects. And it's also demonstrating the changes that they have been going through. How that fidelity finally has been demonstrating over the time that they were separated, or the time that they weren't able to see each other. And how that fidelity has now become stronger, more firmer, more coherent, and more righteous in a way. From verses 25 to 38, it says, "Then Yosef gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to return each man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey." So here we continue seeing how Yosef is being guided by the Eternal's Ruach. He is not keeping that money to himself, but instead he is sending it back. And he is sending it back with these two purposes that we're going to see as well. The first purpose is that obviously that money does not belong to Egypt. It belongs to the Israelites. It belongs to his father. And it's their wealth that they had been provided by Elohim. And on the other hand, we also see that this was another test that Yosef was putting on his brothers, to see that if the next time they had come, or the next time that they present themselves before him, if they were going to reveal about this money that had mysteriously appeared in their sacks, and if they were going to try and give it back. We continue reading. It says, "So it was done for them. Then they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left from there. As one of them opened his sack to give fodder to his donkey at the lodge, he saw his money. Behold, it was in the opening of his bag. So he said to his brothers, 'My money has been returned. Look, it's in my bag.' Their hearts sank." So here we see that they feel fear. That feeling when you realize something that probably shouldn't have happened in that way, or when they realize that something isn't right and that they could potentially suffer consequences for that feeling where the heart just sinks and becomes heavy, because they understand and they think, this is what they begin to think, that they're going to have consequences, and they're going to think that they're actually spies, that they're actually there to steal from Egypt. So this is where we begin to see that fear that they have finally for something that they didn't even do. Maybe they felt that they stole the money. Maybe they felt that that money was just was not done right, and it was not given to them in the right way, that they should have never had that money, that was the money that they took to Egypt to give to the Pharaoh for the grain of food. But we see that now they have the money and they begin to feel fear. And this isn't a fear that we saw demonstrate itself when they were going to sell Yosef. This isn't a fear that we saw when they were doing those bad actions behind their father's backs. We don't see this fear manifest itself when they were walking away from their responsibilities that they had with their father. So this is a fear that we begin to see demonstrate itself. And it's a fear that also lets us understand that there has been a change within their hearts. Now we continue reading, and it says, "Trembling, each one turned to his brother and said, 'What is this that Elohim has done to us?' When they came to their father Yaakov in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, "The man, the Lord of the land, spoke with us harshly and took us as spies of the land. But we said to him, 'We're honest. We've never been spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan.' Then the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, 'By this I'll know if you're honest. Leave one of your brothers with me. As for the hunger of your homes, take and go. Then bring your youngest brother to me, so that I may know you are not spies, but you are honest. I'll give you back your brother, and you can move about freely in the land.' Now, as they were emptying their sacks, behold, there was each man's bundle of money in his sack. When they saw their money bundles, they and their father, they were afraid. Then their father Yaakov said to them, 'You've made me childless. Yosef is no more. Now Simeon is gone, and next you'll take Benjamin. Everything is against me.'" So here we begin to see that Yaakov is beginning to feel this despair as he begins to see that his children just disappear from him, or that his children just don't return back to him from wherever they go. And it's this fear that he has now that makes him exclaim against his children or against his other sons, saying that they've made him childless. And it's really interesting to see, because Yaakov in this portion, he isn't really letting himself be led by the Eternal. And we understand this because whenever he is actually being led by the Eternal, and when he's listening to the Father's will, we see that he is called Israel, the name that was given to him by the Eternal's Malach. But when he is not listening to the Eternal's Ruach, and when he is thinking more on the flesh, his name is Yaakov. And it's really important to note this, because this decision that Yaakov had made was causing his children to not be able to get back or to head back to Canaan. They were not able to go back to Canaan and get the food that they needed. But we're going to see that this is really important. This is a very important detail that the Eternal also allows in Yaakov's life, and this hardening that he had in his heart and this fear of losing more children, so that he could continue on fulfilling his will through Yosef. We continue reading. It says, "Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, 'You can put my 2 sons to death if I don't bring him back to you. Put him in my hand, and I will return him to you.' But he said, 'My son will not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone remains. And if harm should happen to him along the way you're going, you'll bring my gray hair down to Sheol in grief.'" So from verses 25 to 38, we see how the brothers return to Yaakov, and they tell him everything that happened with the governor of the land. And that is how they recognize Yosef. They recognize him as the governor or the lord of the land. That is how they saw him, as the authority. And they tell Yaakov what happened to them, exactly what happened to them, and that it was necessary for them to bring the younger brother so that Simeon could return with them, and they could also receive food. But again, as we analyze, we see that Yaakov decides to not send his son Benjamin. In fact, he tells his children that they had already deprived him of children, that he was becoming childless. When we see, and he has plenty of children there, as well as we see with Reuben, he also has grandchildren. So Yosef no longer existed in Yaakov's mind, and Simeon was not with them at that moment. And so now they wanted to take his last son, Benjamin, for him. And he was trying to hold on to his last hope. Now, we're going to begin reading chapter 33 from verses 1 to 2. And we're going to continue seeing how this story continues unfolding. In verses 1 to 2, it says, "Now the famine was severe in the land. When they finished eating the grain they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, 'Go back, buy us a little food.'" So here we see how the Eternal now corners Yaakov and his children, so that they had to return to Egypt to get food because the famine was severe in the land of Canaan. How much time had passed? We don't really know. The text doesn't really specify. But we understand that if the famine had gotten severe in the land and they were running out of food, then it is because a long time has already passed. So during that time that Yaakov and his children were back in Canaan, we have to remember that Simeon was also back in Egypt with Yosef. So Yaakov had really given up on his children Simeon, or on his child Simeon, in order to maintain Benjamin with him. And we continue reading from verses 3 to 5, that it says, "But Judah said to him, the man warned us firmly, saying, you won't see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send our brother with us, we will go down to buy grain for you for food. But if you don't send him, we won't go down. Because the man said to us, you won't see my face unless your brother is with you." So now here we see that Yehuda is starting to talk to his father and trying to reason with him, reminding him everything that had already happened and that they had told him, and that it was necessary for Benjamin to go with them in order for them to get food. Otherwise, Yosef, the governor of Egypt, was not going to allow them to see him and take food until they brought their younger brother with them. So we see how now Yehuda is the one speaking up. And this is a very interesting detail to note, because Reuben, who was the oldest one, was the first one to speak up. But Yaakov did not really listen to Reuben. In fact, he almost, how would be the correct word to say it? He almost dismissed what he was trying to say, and instead kept it to himself, he stood firm in his own judgment to not send Benjamin, even if Reuben was going to be in charge as the oldest one of his children. And we could probably think this as well, because Reuben, being in charge as the older brother, he was not able to take care of his youngest brother, Yosef. But now here we see that Yehuda is standing up, and he is now speaking before his father. And it's important to remember that he is also the fourth son of Yaakov. We see that it's Reuben, then we see that it's Simeon, and we see Levi. But Yehuda is the fourth one. And Reuben had already spoken, but Simeon was left in Egypt. And what we could potentially think as the third oldest to speak up, instead of him, Yehuda speaks before. And this is a very important detail that we must take consideration of, and that we're going to understand and continue analyzing in a couple of more verses. In verses 8 to 9, it says, "Then Israel said, why did you do evil to me by telling that man that you have another brother? They said, the man questioned particularly about us and about our relatives, saying, is your father still alive? Do you have a brother? So we spoke to him on the basis of these words. They spoke to him truthfully. They told him everything that was truth, who their father was, and that they had more brothers, that it wasn't just them. So they spoke with the truth. They spoke with integrity." And it continues saying, "How could we possibly know that he would say, bring your brother down? Then Judah said to his father Israel, please send the boy with me, and we'll get up and go, so that we'll live and not die, we and you and our children. I myself will be his pledge. You can demand him back from my own hand. If I don't bring him back to you and place him before you, then you can blame me all my days." From verses 8 to 9, Yehuda takes responsibility for taking care of his brother Benjamin and bringing him back, telling his father in verse 9, "If I don't bring him back to you and place him before you, then you can blame me all my days," meaning for the rest of his life. The task that Yosef had given them was pushing them to make decisions that took into account the well-being not only of their families, but of those that were with Yaakov's family, such as his servants and also his cattle. These verses show Yehuda making a decision to take on himself the great responsibility of taking care of his brother Benjamin, without knowing that what were the intentions of that man who had authority in Egypt. And this is also an interesting shadow of how the leadership in Israel, which came from Yehuda because they had the scepter until Shiloh came, were also going to be tested by the Messiah, to see if they had shown fruits and if they had guided the people under the instruction of the Father as it was entrusted to them. We see within the scriptures that when the Messiah came, that leadership is like a fig tree that bears no fruit. So the Messiah cursed it to be barren, to never bear fruit again. So the responsibility of the leadership in Israel was that they had to guide the people to become or to produce fruits of the teshuvah, of returning to obedience to the Father. But they had become corrupted, and they only diverted the people from the truth and abolished the Torah for their tradition of men. They rejected the Messiah and the correct interpretation of the Torah, and because of that, they were removed from the authority they had. The kingdom was taken from them, and Yeshua gave it to his 12 emissaries, who were going to produce fruits, and whom the Father, through the Messiah, had established as the heads over the 12 tribes of Israel. Now returning to Genesis, or Bereshit chapter 43, Israel finally entrusts his son to the Eternal, and orders his children to bring gifts to the to the Lord from that land of Egypt, and also return the money that had been presented inside their sacks. If we continue reading verses 10 to 14, it says, "If we had not delayed, we could have returned twice by now." Then their father Israel said to them, "If it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best products of the land in your bags, and bring an offering down to the man, a little balsam and a little honey, gum and myrrh, pistachios and almonds. Also take in your hand a double portion of silver, and bring back in your hand the silver that had been returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was a mistake. Take your brother too. Now get up, go back to that man. May El Shaddai grant you mercy before the man, or grant you favor before the man, so that he may release your brother to you, along with Benjamin. As for me, if I am bereaved, I am bereaved." At this point, Yaakov is no longer called Yaakov, but he is called Yisrael, showing that he was thinking guided by the spiritual. And he was entrusting himself to the Shaddai, or the sustainer, so that he would be the one to do his will as he let Benjamin go with his brothers. In verses 18 to 22, it says, "Then the man took this offering, and they also took the double portion of silver in their hand, as well as Benjamin." Here they are obeying to what their father had told them. "So they got up and went to Egypt and stood before Yosef. Then Yosef saw Benjamin with them. He said to the one over his house, 'Bring the man into the house, slaughter an animal and prepare it, for the men will eat with me this afternoon.' So the man did as Yosef said, and the man brought the men into Yosef's house. But the men were afraid, because they had been brought into Yosef's house. They said, 'It's because of the silver that was returned to our sacks the first time that we are being brought in, to pounce on us and fall on us and take us as slaves, along with our donkeys.'" So here we see that the fear that they had because of the silver that had appeared continues to show up to this moment. And it shows in a way that they start to have ideas in their mind as to what consequences they were going to face for that silver that had just appeared in their sacks that they didn't mean to take. So they begin to show this fear by these ideas that they start to create in their minds. And it says, "So they approached the man who was over Joseph's house and spoke to him at the entrance of the house. 'I beg your pardon, my lord,' they said. 'We indeed came on the previous occasion to buy grain for food. When we came to the lodge and opened our sacks, behold, there was each man's money at the opening of the sack, the full amount of our money. So we've returned it in our hand. Moreover, we've brought down other money in our hand to buy grain for food. We didn't know who put our money into our sacks.'" So Joseph's brothers were afraid of the consequences that they were going to suffer because of the silver that had appeared inside their sacks. And it is interesting to see how they were filled with fear, because when they sold their brother Yosef, again, returning to this point that we mentioned earlier, we don't see the same fear demonstrating when they sold him. They did not fear the consequences that they were going to have within their family as they received money for him from the merchants. So here we can actually also see another change that had been made within the hearts of these brothers. On the other hand, we also see how they show their integrity in verses 21 and 22, when the brothers told their father the whole truth about what had happened to them, and obeyed him when he told them to take the silver back to Egypt and to take more silver so they could buy another ration of food. They could have separated and gone with the silver to another place like they used to, or only present Yosef with the second amount of silver without returning the first. But it was not like that. Instead, they explained themselves to Yosef and wanted to give him both amounts of silver, both the one that had been returned to them in the sacks and the one that they had brought to buy food. Previously, they lied to their father Yaakov about what happened with Yosef. They did not tell the truth. They were not upright, but they allowed themselves to be moved by the malice that was within their hearts. As we remember their previous actions and analyze them with their recent actions in these chapters, then we can see that there has been change in the integrity of Yosef's brothers. Now we continue seeing from verses 27 to 29. Be at peace, he replied. Don't be afraid. Your Elohim and the Elohim of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. Your money had come to me. So here they're confirming that they actually received the money, but it was returned to them because it didn't belong to them, but instead it belonged to the people of Israel, or to Yaakov's descendants, children. Then he brought Shimon out to them, and the man brought the men into Yosef's house, gave them water, and they washed their feet. He also provided fodder for their donkeys. So here we see that they are being treated much better than what they actually thought they were going to be treated. So they prepared the offering for Yosef's coming at noon, for they had heard that they were going to eat there. When Yosef came home, they brought him the offering in their hand into the house, and they bowed down to the ground to him again. Then he asked if they were well and said, Is he well? Your elderly father that you told me about, is he still alive? Your servant, our father, is well, they said. He is still alive. Then they knelt and bowed down. Then he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your youngest brother whom you mentioned to me? Then he said, May Elohim be gracious to you, my son. So finally, in the very last verses of chapter 43, we see the reunion between Yosef and his 11 brothers, now including Benjamin. Another important point that we can observe regarding the change of the brothers is how they could have lied to him about who his younger brother was. They could have shown some servant as if he were to be their brother, but they did not. They took the actual Benjamin, obeying Yosef's orders. And so this chapter concludes with the reunion of Yosef and his 11 brothers, when he finally reveals to them who he really is, and showing this unification among the 12. They're united again. This test that Yosef gave them finally showed that his brothers had changed, and that they were worthy of receiving the blessing of going to Egypt, and not suffering from the famine that was found in Canaan. If they had remained proud as they used to, holding grudges, telling lies, and being carried away by impulse and emotions, then they would not be found fit to see Yosef, and they would not have been able to receive food and bring back to their house. And Yosef, being a shadow of the Messiah, showed how the Messiah was also going to come to test the hearts of the Israelites within the first century. The Messiah came for the lost sheep of Israel, as he said in Matthew 15, verse 24. But he responded, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He came to test every Israelite to see who was going to be a part of that remnant that was going to return to the eternal, and be part of a single fold with Yeshua as their shepherd or their teacher. In the good news of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can find examples of how Yeshua tested not only his Talmidim, but also the Pharisees, and all those who sought to follow him. And another example that I would like to mention that is also pretty interesting to analyze, and that it has also various examples within it, is what we can find in John chapter 6, where we find the story of a crowd that followed the Messiah, and how after they had received food from him and his disciples, they continued looking for him. Yeshua then speaks harshly to them when he saw them, similar to how Yosef spoke harshly to his brothers. In John 6, verses 26 to 27, it says, Yeshua responded to them, Amen, amen, I tell you, you seek me not because you saw signs, but because you ate all the bread and were filled. Don't work for food that spoils, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him the Elohim the Father has put the seal of approval. Yeshua knew the true intention of that crowd that followed him, which was not to receive spiritual food, but rather because they sought to benefit themselves through Yeshua, to satisfy the hunger that their body had. Therefore, Yeshua tests them, showing them the truth behind their intentions, speaking to them about how he was the true bread that had come down from heaven, and that only through him can we all reach the Father. But these people did not understand. They were veiled and unbelieving, finally showing that their hearts were not prepared yet, that they had not done teshuvah, and therefore they were rejecting the true spiritual food that descended from the celestial, the written word, which is the Torah, and also the living word, which is Yeshua. The two pillars that confirm each other. How Yeshua confirms the Torah, and the Torah also talks about Yeshua. Now, in this chapter, not only do we see that the multitude was tested, but also the Talmidim, all of those that were following Yeshua and that had called themselves disciples. In verses 61 to 66, it says, "But Yeshua knew his disciples were murmuring. So he said to them, 'Does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man going back up to the place where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is of no benefit. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and are life. Yet some of you do not trust.'" Yeshua knew from the beginning who were the ones who did not trust, as well as which one would betray him. Then he told them, "For this reason I've told you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by the Father." From this time, many of his disciples left and quit walking with him. Being students of the Messiah was not an exception so that they were not tested. And it did not mean that they were going to receive a higher position so that higher position than others, or that they were going to be found perfect. Instead, this put them in an even greater test to demonstrate if they were really students of the Messiah, if they had learned the truth of the Torah, and if their hearts were circumcised. Because one could call themselves a disciple or a follower of the Messiah, but not everyone is an actual Talmidim. Not everyone is an actual student of Yeshua, and not everyone is actually following his steps completely. And we also see this when they leave behind the tradition of man and their previous life. We see that this is how they demonstrate that their hearts have been circumcised, to follow the anointed one that was sent by the Father. As he said, because it was only through him that they were going to be able to receive that true bread. Finally, we see that many of his disciples, or Talmidim, did not resist this test. The burden or responsibility was very heavy and great for them, thinking that it was really difficult to follow the Messiah, and it was something that no one could do. And they decided to return to their past life and no longer follow the Messiah. But even after this, we find another test, and this test was now towards his emissaries, his shaliachim. In verses 67 to 69, it said, "So Yeshua said to the 12, 'You don't want to leave also, do you?' And Shimon Peter, or Kephas, answered him, 'Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have trusted and have come to know that you are the only one, or you are the Holy One of Elohim.'" His 12 emissaries, or his apostles as they're known, except for Judas, who had the role as the one who was going to deliver the Messiah, they were able to show Yeshua that they were really willing to follow him, despite the fact that many things were still veiled for them. Because within the scriptures, we can see that there were moments where they would fail to realize or understand parables that Yeshua would teach them. And we also see that in certain occasions, or in almost the majority of them, and it wasn't revealed to them until later on, that they failed to understand the importance, or that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and then be resurrected by the Father and exalted at his right hand to bring redemption to everyone who believes in him. Now, reflecting on what we just analyzed in chapter 6 of John, all of these examples, And also, from we analyze in chapter 42 to 43, with Yosef testing his brothers, we can understand who really becomes a part of that remnant that has their fidelity tested to see if they can receive the blessing, the spiritual food that brings eternal life and that never perishes. And they are not those who only seek to satisfy their flesh. In John chapter 6, the first group that was exhorted or tested by Yeshua were still clinging to the earthly things, to the things that their flesh craved. And they did not have their eyes fixed on the heavenly, and also continue with the influence of the leadership of the first century, since they could not understand that Yeshua spoke in an allegorical way when he was referring to his flesh and blood. Today, all those who continue under the Pharisaic influence, that is, under the influence of the traditions of man, like religions, customs, cultures, pagan celebrations, etc., all of these cannot receive the Messiah, but instead they reject him, and therefore they are not fit to receive the spiritual food. Because of their flesh, they cannot see nor understand the true word, the true instruction of the Father that Yeshua came to bring. In addition, they live clinging to their eternal lives, not wanting to leave behind the material, everything that's ephemeral, that is going to perish. But we see that there are actually those who have their eyes fixed on the heavenly and that are busy creating treasures in heaven, not on earth. As we see Yeshua teach in Matthew 6 from verses 19 to 21, that we shouldn't store up for ourselves treasure on this earth, where the moth and the rust destroy it and where thieves break in and steal, but instead we must store for ourselves treasures in heaven, where neither the moth nor the rust destroy and where thieves do not break in or steal. And it says that from where your treasure is, there will your heart also be. But if we're busy making treasures on earth, then where is our heart? That is a question that we should all ask ourselves and reflect on. The Eternal tests us every day to show us if our heart is really guided by the celestial, by what is eternal, or if it is still in the earthly, if it is still living in the flesh. Therefore, it is necessary to strive every day to show ourselves before the Creator as people whose priority is to serve Him, and who are busy producing fruits of obedience, holiness, righteousness, consecration, exaltation, prayer, and more for Him. Let's not be like that crowd that was tested by the Messiah, showing that their hearts really follow the earthly food that the world offers, like distractions such as music, parties, friendships, relationships, etc. We also learned that they are not those who, being Talmidim, in quotations, of Yeshua, at the moment that they are tested in their obedience and emunah, or their faith, they are defeated by their flesh, and they see following the Messiah as something difficult or impossible to do. And they give up and prefer to return to their previous life, as we saw. The second group, the Talmidim, showed Yeshua that they really did not have a circumcised heart. They were not prepared yet to follow him, but were easily defeated by the tests that Elohim put through Yeshua. But we also see that those who are actually going to be part of that remnant are those who listen to Yeshua's words when he said in Luke 13, verse 24, "Make every effort to enter through the narrow door. For many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able." Many will try to enter through the narrow door, those who seek to be Yeshua's Talmidim. But because of the test they will face when bearing the hardships of this world, it will not be easy for them, and it will become a heavy burden. That is why Yeshua tells us that we must strive to enter the kingdom. In addition to making an effort, they show that there has been a renewal of their mind, because they have understood the truth of the scriptures and no longer seek to be the same person who they were before, living in sin under the rule of death. And finally, they are not those who, in the first, second, third, or even 10th test, reject and deny the Messiah and seek to return to their previous life. But they are those who recognize the only anointed one sent by the Father and go after the word of life, knowing that every trial is for the good of every believer. and that if we make an effort in this pilgrimage, we will be able to reach the goal, which is eternal life. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, it says, "Now we know that all things work together for good for those who love Elohim, who are called according to his purpose." And we also see in Philippians chapter 3, verses 13 to 14, "Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself as having taken hold of this, but this one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead. I press on toward the goal for the reward of the upward calling of Elohim in Messiah Yeshua." Today, the Eternal continues to test us through the Messiah. He tests us in our obedience to him, whether we are really willing to leave our past life, to leave what holds us to this world, in order to see if we are worthy to receive the blessing through Yeshua. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 8, it says, "For the one who sows in the flesh will reap corruption from the flesh, but the one who sows in the Ruach will reap from the Ruach eternal life." Let us show those true fruits of having done teshuvah, of having returned to the eternal through the Messiah, so that when we are being tested by him, we don't find ourselves still in our flesh. As Shaul said to the Galatians, "Everyone who sows for his own flesh will reap corruption." They will not have eternal life. They will not receive the true food, and they will not receive the true word of life. Just as Yosef's brothers showed a change in their hearts, a change of integrity, when they appeared before him, so must we. So we must strive, so we demonstrate ourselves before him. When he returns to us, and when he returns for judgment, we can present ourselves as worthy of receiving the promise of eternal life. So with this, we have now reached the end of this video. We ask if you could please give us a like and share it so many more can also learn about this topic. Thank you so much for accompanying us today. Blessings and shalom.